I'm going to do just a super quick introduction because I know that Dr. Inwood will also talk about her role here on campus. But let's see, we met, and Shoshanah was running a farm at the time, and I was a registered lobbyist at the time. Good old days. Anyway, so as a rural sociologist, you're going to get a good flavor of her agenda. She advises everybody from county commissioners to senators to presidential campaigns, and I think it's just you're gonna kind of hear an arc of her research really having an impact today. And with that, so an associate professor over in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And oh, and wait, real quick. Questions. We'll hope to stand up questions till the end.
Okay, thank you, Joey. So it's delightful to be here. And we're going to talk about some of the invisible issues that are affecting agriculture in the United States. So first off, how many of you in this room eat? Perfect. You all are connected to this presentation, right? And we're actually going to be looking and diving into some of the invisible issues that affect our food and agricultural system. So what I thought I'd do today is give you a little bit of an overview of the career path I took, which is very windy, a little bit about my research and extension position, and then really dive into the meat of the research that's been looking at some of the social issues affecting agriculture and really focusing in on childcare, and a little bit about health insurance that I also work on. And then talk a little bit about how do you make these invisible issues visible through extension, outreach, engagement, and policy. Oh, but what I wanted to say with this picture is a lot of this work has actually been influenced by my own life experiences, and I'm sure that you bring those with you to graduate school as well, and the topics that you choose to study. And a lot of this is really informed by my own two children. So I put this up because I think sometimes, especially when we look at Facebook or social media, there's these beautiful images, right, of people just look like this idyllic setting. Look what a wonderful time we're having. And I can tell you about a minute, literally a minute after this picture was taken, my son came over and he's stuffing cherries in his mouth and just vomited all over me. Okay, and that is the reality of cherry. Okay, so as Jill mentioned, I used to farm. I actually grew up in the city, but then deferred going to the Peace Corps and wanted to learn about, how to farm. And so circa 2007, the dawn of the millennium, a friend and I started a 5-acre organic vegetable farm up in Richland County, right outside of Mansfield. We were certified organic and sold direct marketed down at the North Market. I had to stand outside the North Market and sold into a CSA that was delivered to Clintonville. And while I was farming, we were also working 2 part-time jobs off the farm to make ends meet. And we were also trying to date. Was the community, because that's what you do when you're in your 20s, right? And really, finding it very stressful for trying to juggle all of these things. And at the same time, the folks that we were renting from had lived in this community for a long time in Lucas, Ohio, which is right next to Mansfield, which is part of the Rust Belt, right? And that there has been a lot of factory closures in that area. And so the folks that we were renting from, right, they didn't know sometimes whether their factory jobs were going to be there in a week, in a month, or in a year. Right, and that introduced a lot of social disorganization into the family and into the community. And when I went to grad school, I really wanted to understand how do you make a living in rural America off the land after witnessing and experiencing all of these different challenges. So my path is actually, my undergraduate was in biology, then I went to environmental science, then I saw the light and went to rural sociology. And I wasn't always committed to being in academia. I actually used to work for Ohio State government. I was the first farm to school coordinator in the state, working with the Ohio Department of Agriculture and the Ohio Department of Education, and then directed the Office of Sustainable Agriculture until that office was closed when there was a change in governor. Then I went off to the University of Vermont for 5 years. I was in the Department of Community Development and Applied Economics, and then OSU came calling. We had family in the area, decided it was time to come back. So based in the School of Environment and Natural Resources, but I actually live and work at Ohio, I don't live on it, but I work at Ohio State's Agricultural Research Station, which is in Worcester, Ohio. So this is a map. It's about an hour and a half from the John Glenn School exactly. You just go up 71 and over 30. It's also known as the gateway to Amish country. We have one of the largest Amish populations in the world. We have hitching posts at Walmart and our gas stations. And I co-direct the Center for Community and Working Landscapes up at OARDC with Doug Jackson Smith. So please, if you're ever up in the area, we'd love to have you. It's a collaborative space. We also have standing desks for all of our visiting scientists. So we try to make it fun. Okay, so a lot of the work I do is when when we think about sustainability in the food system, right? Really simply, there's that Venn diagram, right? The economic, the environmental, and the social parts of sustainability. But we know that in reality, it's much more complicated than that, right? And this is really kind of the place where I try to think about, and how does the social really fit into these systems that when we're trying to build sustainable, resilient food and agricultural systems. And a lot of the times, right, it's much easier to define economic and environmental sustainability, right, and to come up with indicators for what they are, while social sustainability really remains the most opaque. And oftentimes, we conflate economic profitability with social sustainability, right? And so what this research is really trying to do is how do we move the needle a little bit along about understanding what is social sustainability. So my position of itself is actually 60% extension, 30% research, and 10% teaching. Okay, how many of you know what extension is? Okay, about half. Great, great. So we were at a land grant university. Everybody, as folks understand what a land grant is, we have kind of a mired past, right? Right after the Civil War, we're in the midst of the Civil War. There was an agreement with Justin Morrill, who was a senator from Vermont. All the states were given land to sell. Often this land was actually occupied by an indigenous Native American population. The land was sold to help fund the land grant university system. So all of the big 10 are examples of the land grant university system. There's one in each state. And the idea was really from Justin Morrill that education shouldn't just be for the elite, but it should be really democratized. And you have both a liberal arts and agricultural mechanical arts education. There's a lot of iniquities though, especially when the 1862s were first established, right? Those primarily really served white folks. And then there are the 1890s, which are the historically black colleges and universities. And then most recently the 1994 land grant universities, which actually service Native American communities. And so within extension, there's a lot of different ways that extension is a part of the land grant system. How many of you know who your county educator is? Okay, a couple people. How many county educators? Well, no, how many county extension offices are there in Ohio? 88, right? Because there's 88 counties, so every county has an extension office, right? And the idea was, okay, you're supposed to be able to translate what's happening in the research realm out into the community. But really, extension also works the other way, where people who are on the ground can help the researchers understand what the needs are. And in my position, where I really work both at the national level and the state and local level, it's really working in partnership with the communities. So even though I have a split, really my work is very much integrated extension and research. You can't do one without the other, the work that I'm doing. Okay, so we're going to talk about family farms for a moment. What's the average age of an American farmer? Yeah. 62. 62, a little bit younger.
55.
67, 58.9. Okay, right? So those of you who work in workforce, think about that number. What happens when the average age of your worker is 58.9? What percentage of the American farm population, I'm sorry, what percentage of the American population actually farms? Less than 2%. Yeah, so less than 2%. So we have this aging and shrinking farm population, right? So there's a lot of questions about who these farms are, who's going to be these farmers in the future, right? And then when we talk a lot about who are farmers, right? 98% of America's farms are actually family farms, right? And make up 88% of the production. And this is really important because we're going to come back to this, because if your structure is based on family farms, what do families usually include? Children. That's where childcare also becomes really important, right? So there's this huge crisis, right? Who's going to be the next generation of farmers in America? And the way that USDA has really approached this is really to focus in on increasing opportunities for access to land, markets, skills, getting access to capital, all of which are really super important. But we often forget that farm operations and individual families are embedded in larger social systems, larger economic systems, and larger government systems. And when there's major policy changes like the Affordable Care Act, or debates about childcare, those major policies are actually going to affect farm families as well, right? Because a lot of times we tend to judge the success or failure of an individual operator based upon their accounting system or their production skills, right? But you really need to start to take account how these larger systems, right, affect the opportunities and choices that they make. So I'm a sociologist, so I think a lot about structure and agency, right? And how those two things work hand in hand. So the world that I live in and spend most of my time is really thinking about how these social and household factors affect farm families, and really thinking about childcare and health insurance. And today I'm really going to focus mostly on the childcare and thinking about how access to affordable, quality childcare and also health insurance affect economic development, quality of life, social and economic well-being, and also food systems resilience. Okay. And I want to say that all the work that I do and I'm doing research that's both qualitative and quantitative really does recognize that we have a very heterogeneous farm population, right? So it's really important to understand that individuals have different histories, different experiences based on their race and ethnicity, their gender, their sex, and a whole other suite of demographics, right, that are going to affect their experiences, and also recognizing that there's intersectionality that is also going to affect their experiences. So it's also really just important to keep that in the back of your mind. So when we slice and dice data, a lot of times we're trying to keep in mind those different demographics and how things play out for different folks. So within the farm persistence literature, right, there's this question about why have family farms actually persisted? Why don't we just have those large corporate consolidated farms, right? Like the equivalent of just having Walmarts and Best Buy across our landscape. Why do we still have so many family farms and still have so many small and medium-sized farms? There's a lot of reasons for that. You should take my sociology of food and ag class to get all of the details. So I'm going to just give you like a very high level, right? So one of the things that rural scholars have really understood for many years and have really researched really well is that you can't really separate the farm enterprise and the household, that there's actually an intersection there. And for a lot of work, families are actually subsidizing the farm either through labor, right, that's unpaid, or when there's a downturn in economic conditions or markets, then household off-farm income and household income is supplementing with the farm income, right? But the traditional approach, what's happened is in ag economics, is to really separate out and silo the household and the enterprise with two separate budgets and not really recognize those intersections. So what we know, and we look a little bit more in the literature, especially thinking again about childcare, is right that there's a life course that people go through, right? And if we think about farms and their ages, when you're, I want to just kind of point out what their relationship is at their stage of life and their caregiving responsibilities would be, because that's going to intersect with their business course. Okay, so when you're young, you're probably more likely to have young children, and probably less likely to have many financial resources, right? You're young, you're starting up. Right, as you age, your middle age, right, you have more resources for investment, probably have older children, but you might also be giving caregiving for elder relatives, right, or neighbors. And an older farm household will tend to either de-invest in their farm, getting ready to exit, or reinvest when they're expecting a successor to come on board. And they have adult children and or grandchildren that they may be caring for. Also just want to acknowledge that individuals who are caregiving for children or adults with disabilities, that can continue on for the entire life course as well. Okay, and it's also really important to acknowledge that when you have children and we think about childcare, right? Just childcare is not just from that infant to preschool kindergarten age, right? But that you have to think about the needs. They vary if you're talking about infants, toddlers, elementary school, middle school, high schoolers. I now have middle and high schoolers, and I tell you, they still need care, right? Okay, so when we go to the grocery store, right, or looking through the magazines, you ever see images like this of the happy farm family in the field? Like, I want to be these people, like, look how happy they are, right? But it's really obscures some other truths about having children, which is, you know, you have the baby, and it's like so wonderful, right? You're at the hospital, and then you go home. And it's really, really hard, right? Having children introduces a lot of stress, right? They're very expensive, right? Whether you're using cloth diapers or disposable diapers, they are expensive, and you know, all the gadgets and gizmos they need. And then if you're also a working parent, right, trying to get work done while also taking care of kids is really hard to do, right? And so, you know, my life course, I was having children, right? And I started hearing from my farm friends who are still farming about all the challenges that we were all having, you know, getting daycare and things like that and trying to work. And I started talking to farm service providers and technical assistants and asking them, like, you know, are you hearing things about childcare from the farmers we work with? And we get responses like this. It's not an issue for farmers. They don't bring it up. I don't ask about it, right? I don't really even know what to do with it. Right. And so this is like really interesting because I know that I'm having all these conversations with my friends and myself and like what we're doing. And we can get farm technical assistance providers are saying, no, it's not an issue. So what we do as researchers, we go into the literature, right? Found 2 studies on childcare and farm families. One was from the 90s, that was basically about farm safety and childcare. And the other was from the 1980s, it was a report, it wasn't even peer reviewed, but it was from NORC. So many of you are familiar with NORC. They actually surveyed farm women, and many were actually actively asking for childcare. This is in the 1980s, because they needed childcare in order to further their agricultural careers. Right? Okay, so this research is pretty old, from the 1980s. It's a new millennium. So that means we need to go out and see, is this even really still a problem? Right? Do farm families experience childcare problems? What aspects are they experiencing childcare problems with? Right? And is it actually influencing their farm business? Right? So that was the basic first exploratory research project. Okay, so method. Jill told me I have to give lots of details on methods. So I'm going to overwhelm you with methods. As Jill and I were working on we had a USDA grant that was out in the field, and it's like, this is a good place to like just throw a couple questions on childcare on, right? So back in 2014, we were looking at counties, well, agriculture, like they weren't counties, they were metropolitan statistical areas at the rural-urban interface. It also had high-value agriculture. And we were surveying them and asked a couple questions about childcare, and 186 families with children under 18 were part of the data analysis, right? And just to give you a flavor of who they were, we had a very high proportion of beginning farmers, multi-generational farmers, high sales, so over almost half had over $100,000. So just so you know, like anybody's making $10,000 or less is really what we would classify as a hot earner, right? But these are really substantial production that was happening. And because we were near cities, we saw the majority of respondents were producing specialty crops, livestock, nursery, greenhouse, which is also very labor intensive, right? It's not like growing hay, that's very different. Then I moved to University of Vermont and had some access to some new dollars, and of course I got some new grad students. And so, it'd be really great to also have some qualitative data to go ahead with it, to combine with this quantitative data. So focusing in on the Northeast part of the United States, we did focus groups and interviews with farmers, 43 farmers. We tried to get to all the Northeast, but really just found out with Vermont, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And did inductively double coded and in vivo to identify the salient genes and patterns. Okay, so do farm families experience childcare problems? Shocker, they do. And what we saw, what was really interesting, right, is that everybody experienced childcare problems, whether you were a multi-generation farmer, a first-generation farmer, so like you're new to agriculture, if you're a man or you're a woman, right? And then there was just some differences in the degrees to which these folks experienced childcare. So first-generation farmers were more likely to experience childcare. They were also less likely to have family or friends living in the community, right? And childcare is also very tied to the community. And then in this sample, about men and women were about equal. To say that they had childcare, that they both experienced childcare problems. Okay, what aspects of childcare are a problem? Well, over 2/3 of the farmers surveyed said that they have problems with affordability, availability, and quality of childcare. Right, and what's really important to remember is that this is pre-COVID, and pre-COVID, 3 out of every 5 rural communities is classified as a childcare desert. Right, so what we see is like, the farmers reiterating what we know about the data, where there's just a lack of availability of childcare. So when we asked about how do farmers perceive childcare as an issue influencing their farm business, this is where the qualitative data became really interesting and useful, because we really saw 3 different ways in which childcare actually affects farm households and farm operations. So we divided it up into social, economic, and cognitive ways. And in the social, women really talked about how they had started out either themselves or with their partner being equally known and seen as the farmer in the field, actively planting, actively working with livestock. But when the children came, they'd step back into the household, and while they were still doing work, like especially bookkeeping, which is very essential, right, on the farm, they were not seen as a farmer anymore, right? And they were really struggling with what is their new identity. Right. Also creating a lot of relationships and family tensions. We had folks who were getting divorced over this, leaving farming. There was one particular focus group where a couple talked about how they were, there was a husband and wife, and they're like, this husband was like, we're homeschooling and we're farming, and this is amazing, and this is what we're going to keep doing. And then he got up and left another session to go to another session, and this is at a conference. And then the wife just broke down and said, I can't do this anymore. Right, and we were actually really worried about her mental health. right? So there's lots of different issues that we saw emerging. Economically, right? Farmers talked about how they struggled where farmers markets are scheduled in the mornings for Saturday mornings. Our childcare centers open Saturday mornings. You know, most of them are 9 to 5, right? Monday through Friday. That's the conventional approach for childcare centers. They also talked about organizing their farms, not necessarily where there was good soil and what was appropriate for the crop, but what was the near field closest to the house that they could be working so that they could still keep an eye on the children versus the far field. Right? And again, these issues about how to actually access childcare, finding people who can watch their kids, all of these issues were really impacting them economically. And then this idea about cognitively, about waiting for the future to come, thinking, oh, you know, the kids are going to get a little bit older soon and they'll go to school and I'm going to finally have time. And then the parents who talk to the kids in school were like, you know, we're just so busy right now running around but we're going to get there eventually, right? And we'll have, you know, more time on the farm and the kids are going to want to farm with us. And trying to even imagine what these farms were going to look like were really hard for a lot of the parents. So here's where the health insurance comes in, because at the same time I'm doing the childcare research, also have a USDA grant that's looking at how access to affordable quality health insurance affects economic development and quality of life in the farm sector. And what's really interesting is when we focus in on young farmers, those 18 to 35-year-olds, because we want young farmers who have strong backs, right? It also tends to overlap with their prime reproductive years, right? Something that we don't, the USDA doesn't really account for. So when we look at the structure of health insurance, right? Most health insurance is actually available through an employer, right? That's how most farmers are, you know, accessing health insurance. But the reason that I was doing this study was because we had the Affordable Care Act, remember? And that was supposed to release job loss, where people could then, right, to be able to explore new occupations without having to be attached to a specific job, just in the health insurance. So what we found is that, especially some of these changes that were made with the ACA, a lot of farmers talked about having parental coverage till they were 26 and then facing a cliff, right? And then how important having that expanded Medicaid and subsidies in the marketplace was, because they knew that they had really dangerous occupations that are hard on their bodies. We also saw how important childcare is, I'm sorry, health insurance is for young families with children. This is where I want to spend a little bit of time. Because farmers can be underinsured, and we talked to farm families, and we saw this in the quantitative data as well, where farmers are always going to prioritize their child and their child having access to health insurance. And so the farmer may not have health insurance, but their child may be getting it through the CHIP program, right? The health insurance program, expanded Medicaid. And one of the tricky parts that farmers are trying to really dance around is, well, I could get an off-farm job that would give me more income and access to health insurance, but who's going to watch my kids, right? Or I can get that access to that job and maybe it'll give me some really good resources for my farm, but it doesn't have benefits, and then that's going to raise my income where we no longer qualify for CHIP for my kids. Right? So they're really caught in this middle, right? And really prioritizing what happens with the kids and access to health insurance. Okay. So it's 2020, everybody remember 2024, what we doing? Okay. So remember 2020, right? If you were in the ag world like I was, I actually co-chaired with our OSU College of Ag's COVID-19 and Food Supply Task Force. And that was really a front row window to what was happening. And I had colleagues in Extension talking about the farmers are just making so much money. They're so happy with all the local food sales, and that's all great. Well, like, wait a minute, there's another story happening here too, especially for farm families with young children. And so my colleague, Florence, who used to be my PhD student, actually she's at the National Farm Medicine Center and through surveying the field, trying to survey farmers during COVID and asking how did taking care of children during COVID became harder? No changes became easier. Over 58% they became harder. Right? So really influencing and kind of like busting that myth about, right, oh, the children just work on the farm, right? They just roam the fields happy and free, right? It's not necessarily really the case. And how are you supposed to get jobs done? Kids running around, kids get the blind spot killed. Right? Farms are actually really dangerous places to work, especially if farms have gotten larger and with more sophisticated equipment. So right before COVID, talk about timing. Florence, had moved into this new position. She graduated from OSU and SAR, rural sociology, and was at the Farm Medicine Center, and really wanted to hone in on childcare and the intersection of childcare and farm safety. So what's really interesting is that every 3 days a child dies on the farm. That's a pretty significant statistic. And for 20 years, farm safety experts have actually been telling parents the safest place for your child is off of the farm work site. And but they've never asked parents, well, where can you put your child? What are your childcare options, right? And so we really wanted to look into this a little bit more and to really start to dive in and see how is childcare.
Is that statistic in the US?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And some of it's while they're on the active landscape, and some of it's while they're not being watched, right, going around. So yeah. So we have project funding from USD. I'm sorry, not USD. Different agency, CDC. It's a 5-year project, and we really wanted to try to understand what are farm families' lived realities, right? And what's the role of childcare and farm safety, which is Florence's real interest, and especially because of her position. But my focus has always really been on economic development and quality of life. And so we were able to actually look at both of these issues within the same study. And we focused in on 3 case study states: Wisconsin, Ohio, and Vermont. Florence was in Wisconsin, I was in Ohio, and we both were in Vermont. And Vermont, policy-wise, had some of the most progressive childcare policies in the country. Okay, so this is really a 4-phase project that was really focused on qualitative and quantitative research methods. What's really interesting working with CDC is that extension doesn't really live in CDC's imagination, right? And so there actually wasn't any funding that we could apply for the extension. It doesn't mean we're not doing it, but this is just kind of interesting. When you apply for a USDA grant, it's almost automatically assumed you're going to have some kind of extension in there. So we first started out by doing an environmental scan of farm programs and resources across the 3 states. I'm not going to show you the data from that, but you can guess that there was hardly any mention of childcare in any of the technical assistance for farmers. And then we did key informant interviews with representatives of the farm and childcare sectors of both states. And then we did focus groups and a photo voice activity with farm women. And these we did, I'm going to explain more about this. And these activities are all done in 3 case study states. But seeing what tremendous response we had, and in particular, this happening in the middle of COVID, when America is all experiencing this collective caregiving experience, right? We decided to expand our household survey to be national, right? Originally, it was going to be only the 3 states, but we went national. So our research questions were: what do farm families do with their kids while they work? How do farm safety and farm business considerations intersect with childcare decisions? And to what extent does childcare influence the farm household and farm business strategies? So really trying to understand these intersections a little bit more closely. I know I talk fast. So what we did with methods, this time you'll see we started with the qualitative first, right? And then did the quantitative. So first we started with focus groups. So this was really interesting in 2021. Our goal was to have 36 women in the 3 states of Ohio, Vermont, and Wisconsin, and we gave ourselves 5 weeks to recruit. In 5 days, we had 108 women sign up, and we had to shut down registration and had these focus groups. So we did, I think, 13 focus groups with 68 women. And we did, the inductive and deductive coding. Hannah Budge, who's here, she's our PSP postdoc, is also going to be helping us go through all of this data because we have so much data. And then we did a photo voice activity with a subset of 40 of the women. Have folks heard of photo voice? Some folks have, some folks haven't. So basically, it's a participatory research method where we provide prompts, and then the participants take pictures of their real experiences, of their lives, and then we debrief in a group setting to understand what these pictures represent to individuals. We did 2 rounds of photo voice, none of the 320 photos. And then based upon what we got from the qualitative research, we developed a farm household survey. After a lot of hemming and hawing, we actually did an online survey that was in many ways a snowball sample. Sending it through a lot of different organizations, listservs, and really trying to target folks who are raising children on farms, 0 to 18. We got responses from 47 states and have an analytical sample of 729. Our respondents are really a good representative of American agriculture. Again, we have both beginning farmers and multi-generational farmers. 44% had failed over $250,000. And we had majority of folks who are livestock, field crops, and then specialty crops. So it's a really nice mix. We're really happy with our sample. So for the first question, how are farmers keeping their kids safe? And I want to share with you some of the pictures that the women shared with us from the photo book so that you can really see this in their own words. And what we really found was that it is a juggling act. It is a hard juggling act. And I'm sure those of you with any kind of caretaking responsibilities can relate to that, right? And we saw some really innovative approaches. This one, black and white, is actually a deer camera that somebody had set up in their nursery. So while they were in the greenhouse, they could watch their kids. This fencing is actually a former horse fence for a horse ring, right? They repurposed it for fencing, and farmers said really interesting things. You know, like I can go to NRCS and get money to keep the cows out of the stream, but I can't get any money to keep my kids safe, right, on the farm. We also saw a lot of, folks using family and older kids to help them watching younger kids. We also did see, it was really interesting, a lot of restraints, not like lounging restraints, but right, like keeping kids in the strollers, keeping kids locked in a tractor while they were doing their work outside in the shop. And then we also saw some really interesting things too, like, because people talk about how wonderful it was to have the kids on the farm. And here in this picture, you can see the kids are helping to move, this is meat, right? Frozen meat, and these folks direct market their meat, and the kids, were wearing gloves, right? And they were saying, like, we purposely slow down so that we can teach our kids about our business, how to love farming, how to love this occupation, right? And then also sometimes like when childcare closed, right, you had to do a choice but to bring the kids with you, right? And these are all, or you can't leave your kid alone all day just watching TV. It's a parent who bring their children in the tractors with them. And this is great, and this is wonderful. I will tell you the farm safety experts sometimes start to raise their eyebrows around some of those things, because like if you're in a tractor all day, what they're finding is that those low level vibrations actually affect your spine and your intestinal systems, and can actually lead to a lot of health issues, and they're not sure how that's affecting kids. So when we asked women about, like, how do you, making it all work? These are some of the pictures that the women said back to us. This picture represents how planning our week makes me feel. Meal planning, evaluating my work schedule with my husband, the kids schedule, appointments, farm needs, and more than ensuring we contact the babysitters, right? And so just like women were really open to showing their vulnerabilities. Right. I mean, I cannot tell you how many, almost every focus group we had at least one person cry and talk about how this is really affecting their personal relationships, themselves, their own ideas of self-worth. And it's really pretty stressful. And this also really gets to the invisibility of women's lived realities, right, of raising kids on the farm. Remember thinking about those pictures in the magazine, the narrative, the dominant narrative in the grocery store or the magazine, versus, I guess, summer is coming from the freezer tonight. This picture is an example of how fatigued and annoyed I get from being the person responsible for dinner every night and breakfast and lunch and snacks and everything else around the house, right? This is, the reality that people share. In response, right, to how does thinking about juggling the kids and everything, make you feel, right? It's pretty honest. People were really very willing to be very honest about the ways that they felt. And then there's this other part, this mental health part. There's been a lot of talk about farmer mental health in the news lately, and the women brought up, a lot of this is really focused on production, and it's really about men's issues. I feel stressed, anxious, and tired. And in almost every focus group that we were not prepared for, was almost everyone, somebody identified that they had postpartum depression, right? And we're really talking about also the stress that their kids were having with COVID, their own struggle, and providers not understanding their needs as a farm woman. And that was really interesting as well. So looking at some of the household survey, this is fresh off the press by variant data, because we just collected it in 2023. But we see that farmers are using a variety of strategies to take care of their kids, right? Everything from family and friends to formal childcare providers. And this is a really important one that we tend to overlook is school, right? School is one of the most important childcare providers that we have in this country, particularly if your kids are in public school. It is free. And a lot of farmers talked about between those hours of like 8:30 to 3, how much work they could get done while the kids were at school, right? And especially when you think about from a rural development perspective, how important it is to have good quality public schools, right, for our rural communities and for that rural workforce. That's another really important point that we don't always make the very tight connection to.
Just because you said that time frame, did you explore the frequency of busing? Because it's from most rurals,
Yeah.
it's not gonna be 8:30 to 3.
No, I don't remember on, and maybe I'm making that up. I don't remember the bus in question or not. But that is a really good point. I do know that we can talk about transportation, how important busing is in rural places. Yeah.
And just was, so did you also look at, so were these, all those, surveys administered around about the same time?
Yeah.
And was it over the winter?
No, yes, yeah, because you started farmers.
Yeah, that's. And so the non-school time aspect.
Yeah, so what was really important here is we asked about summer program.
Yeah, that's
And
where it's
actually,
going.
so, and that's also we did ask, so actually, it was a very, in some ways complicated survey because we asked actually specific seasons. So we did what's during the school year and then what's during the summer months and for each age group. So we actually have like a ton of data to be able to figure out because what your options are, like if your kids are in preschool, or daycare, they can actually go year round versus if your kids are in first grade where you're like, oh gosh, summer, what am I gonna do? Right, and that's why, again, my kids have been the best teacher about that. I'm trying to look there. We asked about camps, right, and that's also been a big issue. And then when we think about, especially in the northern latitudes, summers when a lot of production happens, right, and so that's a big conflict. We asked about cost, right, not surprisingly, some people are not being charged, but they've got family or friends, usually family is not gonna charge them for childcare, they themselves are doing the childcare or parent, right? But a substantial amount of folks were paying a lot of money for childcare, right? And they talked about how childcare supplies were well challenged, and even the availability of family and friends to watch children. Over half were saying that that was a problem. And again, this kind of pushes back against that narrative of how, there's grandparents and extended family on the farm to watch the kid, right, in this idyllic landscape. We looked at actually how this affects farm productivity. Everybody said, right, taking care of children affects their ability to get farm work done, right? And this was even more so, right, if you're having problems finding childcare, right? And if you have no friends or family available, right, that actually, right, exacerbates the problem even more. And we asked, right, have you actually even made any changes since the arrival of kids? Right, and 78%, the majority said yes, we did. And when we looked at those who made changes, we see that over half were decreasing resources allocated to the farm business, right? And that can mean that they're cutting down the hours that they work. That means that they could be scaling back production. They may be hiring people. There's a lot of different ways that could be playing out. Many were actually leaving the labor market, right? They stopped their off-farm work, or they hired labor for either farm work or their household work. Just a couple of the quotes that we were getting from, this is all again from the quantitative what folks were writing in. Parents in this, this farm respondent from Arkansas really talking about how stressful, right, it was for navigating and trying to find preschool, infant, toddler care, and how expensive it is. Almost went bankrupt and her mental health suffered. It's much easier now that school and childcare is free because she in public schools. Okay. And then this farm respondent from Oregon who said, my wife was a teacher for 10 years. We had our third kid, daycare shut down, we scrambled. And then we decided that she needed to stay home with the kid. It's been very hard to cover the added expense of health insurance at only one. And I will tell you that when we did those focus groups, we were 13 focus groups, we did at the end, we always asked, what else do you want us to know? What else would be helpful? And in every focus group, somebody said, we need help with health insurance. They did not even ask that question, but they themselves brought it up. So what are some of the key takeaways from this, right? Is that the majority, right, a high proportion of respondents are experiencing childcare challenges in some form. They're making changes to their farm and their household to try to balance all of the needs that they have for both farm work, off-farm work, and household responsibilities. And we're really seeing, right, how that farm, household, and enterprise really intersect, and how having children there really shapes the production systems and the relationships within the farm household. So thinking kind of longer term, right, what would be some of the long-term consequences of experiencing childcare challenges on farm business development, farm viability, and farm families' well-being? And this is really where we need some more longitudinal data. We're really going to try to push USDA to start asking some questions on census of agriculture so that we can really see changes over time. And then it kind of opens up our imagination, right? If childcare support increases, right, which we're debating in this country actively, right? What could that impact be on both the farm household and farm enterprise? So for broad implications for research, right, we really need to start integrating both in not just rural sociology, but also really in ag economics, right? What are these social and economic variables that are affecting the household into our research a lot more actively? And around health insurance and childcare. Thinking about extension and farm service providers, right? Them really becoming much more comfortable in acknowledging how these household issues affect the farm enterprise and that these are actually part of risk management. Right, right now, risk management literature or resources for farmers do not acknowledge these. I don't want to say it all, there's kind of like a box that check if you have health insurance, check if you have childcare, but no questions to think about what does that look like, how will that impact my enterprise. And then for government agencies and policymakers, right, how do we really think about these social and household level issues much more broadly in the way we're thinking about agricultural policy, right? And this really brings up these larger American debates about social safety nets. Right, and what role do they play in America, but also in more broadly in the general population, and also very specifically within our food and agricultural system and in our farm population. And I will say that's not just for farmers, but it's also for farm workers. It really affects everybody across the entire food supply chain, regardless of whether you're working in the field, in the processing sector, in distribution, in retail, in restaurants. We really have to contend that these jobs are often the lowest wages and the least likely to offer benefits. And if we really want to create economic development for food and agriculture, we have to address this issue. So what do we do with this, right? We asked the farmers who should represent the needs of farm families in these national policy conversations, and resoundingly, right? They said USDA and farm organizations should absolutely be a part of this conversation, right? And that this needs to be a priority if we want farmers in our country. Okay, so what do we do with all of this? I think I've got enough time to actually talk about how do we go beyond the journal article, because we publish this research, right? Go to the top journals, it's great. But how do we make sure that this actually leaves the halls and the walls of academia, right? It actually has an impact on real people's lives. So how do we make the invisible visible? So I just wanted to share with you some of the techniques that I've tried. I'm really curious to know if you've done them, how successful, what you've done, or what you've done that's successful, because I'm always trying to build that professional toolkit of what can I do, right, that will help communicate research better. So I think one of the things that is also really striking when I was reflecting on this question was sometimes we don't often think about the impact our research has even at a very individual participant level, right? And we had this, one of our participants in the focus groups wrote us and said, I can't put into words what being a part of this process did for me personally. I've been struggling more than I thought, and finally found the courage to talk to the doctor about the anxiety and stress I was carrying around every day. This research is so incredibly needed. Thank you both. And we got a lot of responses like this, which I think is really what has pushed Florence and I to work even harder to make sure that this does not just sit in the library shelf, but that we can extend this out. So just very practically, beyond the journal article, I really try to consistently write research briefs, right? And after talking to lots of folks in the lots of legislative aids, like 1 to 2 pages, that's all it can be, right? High level bullet points, that's what I need. So that's what we really try to consistently do. And then tailoring some of these reports to the places that we're working in. So in all the projects, we kind of give like a landscape. So this one is about childcare. So what is both the agricultural and childcare landscape in Ohio? And we also try to provide like some comparison charts between Ohio, Vermont, and the United States, because every place wants to know how are they unique, right? So really being able to give those data points and translate those for legislators and then also folks who work in the nonprofits is really, really helpful. We worked also really hard to work with the conversation. Those folks familiar with the conversation? Some folks are. It's a media outlet that works with academics to translate our research into things real people can understand. Right? And so to work with some media, and you have to basically be able, they work with you to translate your research into 900 words for a popular press audience. They operate under Creative Commons license, right? So that a lot of other places can just republish. We've had 2 articles with the conversation, and then working a lot with the media. When the media call, you always answer the phone, right? And you always respond. And even if you don't know who to say, then you said, oh, you should talk to Jill, right? She can tell you all about public administration. With the photos that we collected, we actually got some internal funding from OSU, the Office of Outreach and Engagement, to enable the women to curate their exhibits based upon their photographs that they took. So we're about to invite the women to come in online and pick out which pictures that they would like to show, and which quotes that they would like to use, and where they would like these exhibits to happen, so that we have them both online And then we also had funds to create 3 kits to distribute throughout Ohio, Wisconsin, and Vermont to have essentially a traveling picture show photo exhibit that can go around the state. We also just received funding from USDA SARE to actually create decision-making materials for farm families around health insurance and childcare so that it can be added into their holistic farm planning to help give them the tools and conversation starters that they have so that they can start to talk about how these issues influence their enterprise planning. So your research informing policy, this is where last year, 2022, called up some, I was getting a little frustrated about like having my research to fit in the library. And so called them, some of my friends in the nonprofit sector, and I was like, who should I contact and like let them know about this research, right? And Jill, I called Jill, she's like, you should talk to Kelly. And so
One of our grads.
right? And so talk to her, talk to some other folks that folks recommended, and then over the process, also briefed the White House staffers, and then eventually was invited to Congress to testify at these rural quality of life hearings. And I included these pictures, right, because this is actually a farmer here in Central Ohio who works with the National Farmers Union. And I think it's really cool when like a farmer sends you their picture, right? Like, how relevant is our research? These are the things that tell us, okay, maybe we're on the right track. And then I also brought my daughter with me, you may recognize Senator Brown, right? And I was like, this is why I sent you to childcare all those years. So they didn't have this experience. And at the same time, there were farmers, the American Farm Bureau actually included childcare in their 2023 policy priorities, and so did National Farmers Union. And last summer, I was like, we should really come up with an experiment to insert in the Farm Bill. Because the Farm Bill is like a Swiss Army knife. You can insert all kinds of different experiments in there, all different kinds of policies in there around food and nutrition and agriculture, and worked with Senator Brown's office and came up really with an experiment to be inserted in the Farm Bill, which is basically that communities know what they need, but they need the funding. So how can we use rural development dollars to help enable those advancements in either physical resources for childcare or technical assistance. And what was really exciting was that this actually got turned into the Expanding Childcare in Rural America Act in 2023. It was introduced by Senator Brown with bipartisan and bicameral support. And there's a whole long list of organizations that have signed on, and I think there's no new money, so it's really popular. Yeah, that's great. But what this does is it gets childcare in the Farm Bill for the very first time. Right, and so it's a question of how do we help turn the boat very slowly. And the other thing I will just say is that it's been exactly 10 years when I was at USDA for the first time. Secretary Vilsack was still the secretary back then, and there was a farm transitions conference, and I was there as a very young assistant professor talking about this work. And sitting across from lunch from a ag economist from Oklahoma who literally snorted at me when I said that I was working on health insurance and childcare, and like 10 years later. So sometimes it takes a long time, right? And that's not to say, right, that research is just like perfect arc, right? There's lots of twists and turns and lots of rejections that happen along the way, right? But how do you keep building the evidence and moving it forward and working with your partners in the nonprofit policy sector? So I think I probably have gone over time, so I do apologize. But this is our website where I do try to house all of our information and project website.
Yeah, I remember that's a little fast.
Yeah, I really enjoyed your presentation, I have to say. I was wondering when I saw the slide where childcare and healthcare have been issues bugging farmer women for a couple of generations now. And I cannot help but think back further in time, right? The idea in general, I think, is that historically farms were multi-generation. So kids were taken care of by grandparents, and then the younger generation with strong backs could do the work. What changed in farming that the pressure has now increased substantially?
Oh, this is such a good question. This is the changing structure of agriculture, right? And especially since World War II, we've seen a real shift and what they call the bifurcation of farm size, where we've seen a growth in the very large farms and the very small farms and a real loss in the mid-sized farms. And it's increasingly harder to earn a livelihood that will support a family on the farm. And the changing American economy has also meant that there's fewer folks at home to watch the kids. So you may have the grandparents still in the workforce, both parents may be in the workforce. There's been a lot of shifts, and that's also changed rural communities in and of themselves, because as farms have gotten larger, right? You probably are all familiar with the debates about what happens to a community if the downtown has a lot of different independent stores versus if you only have the large big box Walmart and Best Buy in the community, right? But there's a big difference, and that plays out in agriculture as well, right? And so we really see a big difference in community structure with the hollowing out of rural communities. Since the 1940s, the community structure of agriculture, that means that there's less resources available and less community.
And I was thinking of that because of Neil's remark, because I worked with a different university before I came here. There are places in Oklahoma where kids are 1.5 hours on the school bus going over and coming back because those schools are amalgamating and they're no longer really accessible for the rural families. And that must be a nationwide problem.
It is, yeah, and even when I was living in Vermont, that was a huge issue there about kids having to go over the mountain. I think that's also when you look at childcare solutions, right? There's no one size fits all,
Yeah.
right? And so I think especially in rural areas, it's how do we look at also, especially at home-based care. And this is also where it's not just the presence or absence of childcare, but the quality of that care, right? So with this farm bill experiment, the other hope is like, hey, if there's money in there for professional development, and like looks like an extension, which really have a lot of experience with delivering professional development to rural, remote locations, right? How can we try to provide those providers with more professional development to increase the quality of that care as well, increase economic development as well, because those childcare providers are also taxpayers, right? And we also have to contend that oftentimes in childcare, those workers are paid for, right?
Thank you.
I had a question on that last point that you mentioned on the childcare providers. Have you talked to potential childcare providers are currently maybe not offering services for some that are, but might have the potential to expand in this rural areas, and kind of what are the barriers on the supply side?
Yeah, so that's a really good question to study within themselves. And right, you know, childcare providers have been in the news a lot because of COVID, right? And childcare is just not profitable, right? And that's one of the things, like in the US, we somehow expect that it's going to become profitable, whereas in other countries, right? So Florence is from France, and so like we do a lot of cross-national. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, the way that you really do public investments to make these things work, and the way that we do publicly invest in kindergarten and above, right? Like, why are we not making the same investments for younger children? Is an open question. I will say what was really interesting also in May was the Bipartisan Policy Center. They brought together a group of about 25 people from both the farm and the childcare world, and actually co-hosted this with Save the Children to actually like, how do we start coming up with a cohesive rural childcare strategy that people could take to the Hill? And we were in to provide the research base for this. And so what's really, really interesting is that there's now some really interesting commonality founding. And what's been interesting from the childcare side, they're really excited that we're doing this research because usually they're working in the HHS, the Health and Human Services world, and they've never connected this with USDA, and they're loving that this is bringing from the lens of economic development, right? And not just kind of social services, and that there's a real reason for here. So in some ways, it almost feels a little bit like farmers are almost like this Trojan horse for talking about this for all Americans. But it's been really interesting to see the folks coming together.
One time, one more.
So speaking of which, what is the percentage of labor at family farms that comes from the family versus hired help? And how much of an issue is the hired help too?
Oh my gosh, okay, so that's a really great question, and I just saw that stat on Friday, and I don't remember the stat, how much comes from family farms, but it's pretty significant. But the issue, so this is where also like in that article, the 19th, is that this is a huge issue for farm labor. And what's really interesting why we did this research is that actually there's been more research and more initiatives with farm workers than there has been with farmers. And there's actually a lot more with like Migrant Health, Head Start, and some other initiatives around that. That's got a much better handle. And I think what's really interesting is how do we start to kind of create actually this convergence and coalition between farmers and farm workers, because they need each other, and this is really important for safety for everybody and better working conditions for everybody.
Well, and so one thing I didn't mention in the introduction, but now maybe you can see how she won the scholarship award at our society, the Ag and Human Values last year, which all this work contributed to. So thank you, Shoshanah, for presenting your agenda. And are you well, your research, okay, your research agenda, and would you be willing to stick around for a couple of minutes in case we have more questions? Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
There's always those little sign-in sheets with somewhat ridiculous questions that they're beat us.
Never on.